Now I have to find. The speaker this evening is Steven Schwinghamer. He is the historian at the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21. His research explores policies, practices, and places of immigration to Canada. His most recent publication is Pier 21, A History. That came out in 2020, and it was co-authored with Jan Ruska. And Steve's presentation this evening is Railroaded: The Creation of Immigration Facilities in Halifax, 1889 to 1928. And this is the facility at Pier 2. The photograph that was circulated was amazing. I had never seen a photo of the immigration sheds, as they were known at that time. And it was the busiest immigration site in Halifax, serving the Atlantic passenger trade during the peak years of Canadian immigration before the First World War. We welcome this evening Steven, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you, Steve, to continue. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So I guess first up, we have to say that the places we're going to talk about, Pier 2 and the place where I work, the successor immigration site, the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21, they're located in Mi'kma'ki, the land of the Mi'kmaq. The Mi'kmaq are first people of Nova Scotia, and for thousands of years they've lived in Mi'kma'ki, which is the territory that encompasses Nova Scotia, PEI, eastern and northern parts of New Brunswick, parts of Gaspé and Quebec, communities in Newfoundland and in Maine. The Mi'kmaq have shared this unceded homeland with immigrant communities for more than 400 years. And all the residents of Canada are part of a historical and legal relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. Of course, here in Mi'kma'ki, we recall the treaties of peace and friendship. Now, for me as a historian of immigration, before I move into talking about the history of the sites, a land acknowledgement like that begs the question to carry into the present. Here we are in the place with the Treaty of Peace and Friendship. How is that actualized in contemporary settlement immigration? Is it something we consider? Is it something we act on? I would hope, along with going away perhaps with some of the learning content of the site, that you might carry away that question in the spirit of honoring the treaties that do govern the settlement in this space. So, I said I'm a historian of immigration. Well, for historians of immigration to Canada, places are everywhere. Immigration records present column after column, detailing place of birth, destination cities, country of origin, places of refuge, country of last permanent residence, on and on and on, place. Of course, port of entry too figures in the documentation. Although, and this is a funny thing to say, leading into this talk, the point where a person traverses a geographical Canadian boundary can become an incidental detail in a much larger immigration process. Immigration journeys start long before the moment of physical arrival in Canada, maybe at Palau Bidong, maybe at the Port of Spain, maybe in London or Vienna. And the immigration journey extends inland too, following newcomers for years after they cross the border to farms in BC, warehouse work in Brampton, nowadays domestic work in Whitehorse, all over the place. And so our concept of a port of entry and crossing a physical border, I think, needs to be exploded a little bit. But works of scholars on the sites of quarantine and immigration across the country show that there's still a lot to be drawn if we develop a more granular understanding of site-specific experiences of Canadian immigration process at ports of entry. So in exploring the 19th century development of immigration management in Toronto, Lisa Chilton really dealt quite nicely and neatly with the importance of specificity of place, and this helping to determine how immigrants were managed. And in particular, Chilton noted an appropriate grasp of the immigration situation at a port of entry requires understanding how the city was uniquely situated within its larger political, geographical, economic, and sociocultural contexts. Establishing the specific context of a given Canadian port of entry, it assists our historical understanding in a few ways. So first, the built implementation of a border facility, it can give researchers concrete evidence of changes in attitudes, practices, policies, like when the segregation of British subjects and foreigners is built in or removed at a site, or when a medical office or a clinic is expanded or technology changes, and that tells us about what's being done overseas, what screening is being added at our border, and so on. Okay, so first we've got this evidence of change in attitude or policy. The second thing is, like other forms of official documentation about immigration, architecture and construction can be read to inform the personal. So personal testimonies about arriving at a site, they often have abbreviated descriptions or sometimes descriptions that are a bit unclear. And if we can contextualize it with a good working understanding of how the site functioned and operated, we can illuminate and expand those personal stories. We can bring forward and uncover meaning in works that come from memory inquiry. It becomes complementary, and it's really useful. And the third thing is the ways that authorities worked to create and maintain immigration sites. It gives us a glimpse into the relative power and the relative influence of other actors. It positions the immigration authorities in the political culture and political relationships of that time. So at the Port of Halifax, the interests and the plans of major transportation companies controlled the development and the operation of ocean immigration sites. Now, Pier 21 is probably the best known immigration site in the city, and it may be better known to the Canadian public than more significant immigration facilities at Quebec and elsewhere. I do have to say that. I should acknowledge, my position of employment with the Canadian Museum of Immigration at Pier 21. It could distort my perception here, but there's things like, the CBC 7 Wonders of Canada bit several years ago, or media engagement, or the fact that there are college bands and taverns and film companies appropriating our trademarks, but also being named after Pier 21. It's at the foreground in public consciousness. But the history of immigration into Halifax predates Pier 21 significantly, going back to the 1880s. And by the time the Canadian National Railway, CNR, completed Pier 21 in 1928, the immigration branch and partners, the railways, the steamship companies, and so on, had already used several other immigration buildings in the city, notably at Pier 2, the old deepwater terminus. Exploring that past brings us to the crux of the history of the sites, which is strategic changes in rail and ocean transportation led by the transportation companies direct the shifts in passenger and immigration processing in Halifax. The immigration branch was very much a passenger, and sometimes a really cranky and unwilling passenger, in this process of planning and constructing ocean immigration facilities in the city. So the intertwining of immigration operations and transportation interests was partly a practical matter. The city had no efficient link to the inland until well after Confederation. When the rail link was finished in the late 1870s, the rail lines had a profound influence on the shape of the city. The north end of Halifax grew and changed in conjunction with facilities for rail transportation, notably with the creation of the North End Depot and the associated deep water terminus, which opened in 1880. It was located downhill from the northern edge of the Citadel, and it was meant to immediately serve the transportation and business needs of the city. Among the handful of piers at the site was the major passenger service pier for Halifax at that time, which was Pier 2. And it's the poor little stubby thing just on the left of the deep water terminus here. And we'll come back to its unfortunate character a bit later. However, projects to extend rail service and improve ocean transportation on Peninsula Halifax brought about almost the incidental relocation of Halifax's immigration facilities from Pier 2 to Pier 21. So in this way, we see sort of a link between immigration operation and transport companies that was kind of organic, a function of necessary collaboration. But it was also structured under immigration law. You know, it was in the Immigration Act of 1910, transportation companies were required to provide, equip, and maintain suitable buildings for the examination and detention of passengers for any purpose under this Immigration Act. The developments at Pier 2 demonstrate that transportation companies, rather than the immigration branch or department, really held sway over those places of ocean immigration at Halifax. Now, through the late 1800s, the federal government sought to create a transcontinental rail line. And according to the accompanying vision of the country's economy, Halifax would be an ocean access point for the commerce of the nation. This required commercial redevelopment of the city's waterfront and better immigration facilities, including for medical care, detention, and deportation of newcomers. So in Nova Scotia, the Intercolonial Railway was created as successor to local rail lines after Confederation, and that affected the inland rail link between Nova Scotia and central Canada. The ICR, the Intercolonial Railway, was also responsible for the docks and buildings where passengers transferred from ships to trains. The early arrangements, though, were rudimentary, yes. Even a decade after the completion of this inland rail link, ocean passengers they just landed in cargo shed. Now, 1889, the Deputy Minister of Agriculture, because at that time, immigration was under the purview of agriculture, the DM of Agriculture, John Lowe, he visited Halifax and he was not impressed. It was conveniently located, as we saw on the map, but that was its only virtue, right? Immigrants were landed at Halifax at that time at an open freight shed. And since Halifax was mostly busy with passenger traffic, when the St. Lawrence ports were compromised by ice, the Halifax immigration facility was more or less like al fresco winter venue, right on the waterfront. Lowe, in his notes, he says, this means the hardships inflicted on immigrants are very severe, serious sickness having in some cases been caused to delicate children. And Lowe, although I love the way he phrased that, he's actually not selling the whole story there. Through the 1880s and 90s, the annual reports of the Halifax Immigration Agency note occasional deaths among passengers, including children, which are attributed, maybe in a calculated way, but they're attributed to the harsh conditions after arrival, still in a condition of exposure even after getting off the ship. And the shed, it really was minimal. There were washrooms, there was space for baggage handling and ticketing. There was supposed to be some space to shelter women and children, but with the doors open for people to come and go, It was, as Lowe finishes in his notes, altogether insufficient. So based on this, Lowe sought to build a small dedicated immigration building, a shed to accompany an existing cottage building, and it was to be completed by the end of 1889. Despite running about a year late in construction, the result was really poor. The cottage building, which was an older structure, it was supposed to be touched up as part of this. It immediately needed substantial exterior repair. And the new shed, there were gaps opening up immediately in the floorboards. These are buildings on pilings over the Halifax harbor. If you've got open floors, it's no more pleasant than having the sides of the building open. Parts of the exterior shingling came away almost immediately. The interior partitions that were used had gaps so big you could just see from room to room anyway. It was miserable. And other immigration officials working there sent back reports saying things like, the shed proper is not suited for the purpose for which it is intended, nor is there sufficient room afforded to carry on the work without much confusion and attendant delay. During a visit to Halifax a few years later, in August of 1894, the Deputy Minister of the Interior, because in this time, immigration changed hands in government from the Department of Agriculture to the Department of the Interior. So now we've got the Deputy Minister again, but a different guy because of that change. Deputy Minister of the Interior, Burgess, he says the situation was even worse than reported. And I love this, that the building will fall within 3 months. That's not a great thing to hear from your deputy minister, but there you are. So, the building survived for another 6 months, which was a bit better than forecast, but it met its end by fire, 27th February 1895. And I did want to do a little bit of a note on sources. This is attributed here, Nova Scotia Archives, the Harry and Rachel Morton from a specific scrapbook, the Longley scrapbook, which if anyone loves the Halifax waterfront, you must go and look at. It's wonderful from end to end. But this is one of the images that was there, the aftermath of the 1895 fire. Much of the infrastructure at the Deepwater Terminus burned, including the immigration quarters. And actually, just a little aside, the Chronicle at the time, oh my, they came aboard the fire department. There was an incredibly acid report on this fire, accusing the department of basically just throwing their hands in the air and letting Deepwater Terminus burn. This, of course, was serious for the immigration branch and its operations because they had no proper landing facilities. So passengers had to land at Kennard's Wharf, just south of Pier 2, and get examined where the immigration officer still had a small office at the North End Railway Station. And the Intercolonial Railway did move quickly to rebuild, and they had plans in place for a rebuild by the end of the next month. Now, there had already been problems about conflicting authority over the immigration buildings during the previous years, and this led the local agent, Edwin Clay, to believe that the immigration department should obtain direct control over their buildings. He argued at the time that we want to be entirely free from the control of any railway or steamship business. But even as Clay pushed for permanent, independent accommodation, he had to make do with temporary arrangements through another busy winter season. His view on separating the operations of immigration from the interests of the railway was reinforced when he saw their proposed immigration accommodation. There are not words enough in the English language, he wrote, to express my disgust at the mean, contemptible offer, and a greater insult could not be offered by one department to another. He was so incensed that he professed he would even move to Dartmouth rather than accept the railway's proposal. The proposed construction was about half the size of the previous shed, let alone the additional cottage building. So basically the railway is just shrinking them right up. Ultimately, his protest fed up through the department to the ministerial level, and the Minister of the Interior sort of protesting over to railways. In the meantime, the search for replacement accommodation became even more pressing because there was another fire taking Intercolonial Railway's Richmond terminal in the north end near the foot of Richmond Street, sensibly, in May of 1895, 3 months later. Now, this was further from the railway station, but that pier and shed had been used at times to assist in clearing immigrants off of some larger liners. And so, even that option was being taken away. Now, despite the pressing need for a replacement, it was 2 full years after the original fire before a new building was ready. Now, it is possible that the Halifax agent, as strong as his opinions were about the plans, may have played a part in that delay, in that he managed to obtain his own dismissal in the intervening years. He and his wife invented a cleaning lady and then charged the department the notional services of this notional lady, which resulted in him managing to get actually fired directly by the Prime Minister, which, good for him. If you're going to go big. But I think it might have played a little part in terms of the confusion in getting something in place. Anyway, pretty much on the button 2 years later, the Intercolonial Railway does open a small new immigration building at Pier 2. And 5 days later, the acting agent, T.E. Clay, succeeding his brother, who succeeded their father in inheriting this post, which the resilience of political connections in Nova Scotia is just a thing to behold. T.E. Clay reports that the first passenger landings had gone smoothly. Now, that's his perspective. The Allen line, which operated a number of the major liners that called at Pier 2, was less satisfied, complaining almost immediately about the wharf at Pier 2. Remember, we saw it in the map, this stubby little thing. Yes, it was angled, it was short, it was not suitable as the liners got longer. And there was this great pier just to the north of it, Pier 3. Much better for larger liners that had to unload cargo and so on. Passengers unloaded at Pier 3, though, they had to cross railway tracks, freight and cargo areas to get to the immigration office. And Clay writes to the department saying this inconvenience, it's a defect, it should be removed. This wharf is no good. Further, since the space at Pier 3 wasn't designed for processing passengers, it was very easy for people to land themselves and escape examination and just be on their way. The very fact that it was necessary to accommodate the shipping lines in this kind of compromise around a space for inspection and examination, it underscores a real lack of control and influence on the part of the immigration officials by times in the landing facilities for passengers. Now, besides the delay for immigrants in the process, the lack of accommodation in the 1897 building meant that there was no appropriate quarters for detaining immigrants, found inadmissible. They were instructed to place detainees in bedrooms. This wasn't secure. But the superintendent of immigration just said, Pier 2, we probably won't have to detain too many people because we're starting to do more thorough checks overseas. And we'd have a prompt enough removal of refused passengers by the shipping lines that we wouldn't have to have this policy essential element of the building. The checks overseas and the deportation were both in the hands of other agencies, right? They're generally in the hand of the carriers, the shipping lines. And so what you're having is, a distillation, a boiling away of essential function, counting on private partners whose interest is not to spend money on doing these things effectively. Anyway, the deficiencies drove the immigration branch to look for improvements. So in 1903, They think about adding a story to the building in order to improve the handling of passengers. This was based on a plan that, they thought about with Public Works, but it had been put on hold. And there was some coming and going about it, what was the best way to improve the building, but this is the one that got adopted. And by 1903, they kind of hardened onto that road. The plan had a few catches. They forgot bathrooms, didn't upgrade the heating system. They again had planned to add a detention building, but as often happens in these kinds of public works projects, the add-on element got reduced and then eliminated. And then the work didn't start. So it was supposed to start in 1904. Time passed, no indication of progress. Interestingly, the other freight sheds and cargo sheds in the area are being updated and immigration languishes. The department put some pressure on, and there's public interest in improving the passenger arrival too. I mentioned, this is a period of a significant uptick in arrivals. It spurred the project along eventually. And 1905, this one-story added building was presented to the press. It did improve the facility, and it introduced a change that actually we'd see carried on in later buildings at Pier 2 and even at Pier 21, echoing other ocean immigration facilities too, which is getting the passengers up onto the second floor so they could transfer from larger liners directly. And it made it easier in a way to create a contained space for examination. If you got someone up on the second floor being examined before they come down to leave, you can control that space a little more easily in terms of examination and security. So immigration upstairs, downstairs, train tickets, food, social services, and waiting areas before they'd be able to go on their train. So this 1905 building, you've got this huge expansion in immigration to Canada, and inefficiency and conflicts around Halifax. Even with the extra story being added, it was not a welcome thing. So the Federal Department of Railways and Canals, railways again, undertook new plans for better infrastructure at Pier 2. The consulting engineer for the Montreal Harbour Commission, a guy named John Kennedy, was asked by the Intercolonial Railway to improve their harbour facilities at Halifax, including passenger landing facilities. Kennedy starts work July 1910, and after about a year, the plans had passed by the Halifax Board of Trade, steamship and railway representatives, and finally made their way through various government authorities, eventually including immigration. The concept circulated between government departments in 1911, and the initial draft proposed a big building, a structure 200 feet wide, 800 feet long. For people who know Pier 21, it's 100 feet wide and about 530 feet long. So double the width, 60% longer. It's a big building. And after all of the problems caused by this little old short angled pier that had been a Pier 2, it also had a new pier design, a wide, long concrete pier, large enough to handle 2 modern ocean-going liners at once, and it would be built to the south of where Pier 2 was then to give a bigger basin between Pier 2 and Pier 3. The immigration branch, they'd seen the 1897 building and pier deteriorate super fast. And all these recurring efforts by shipping lines to redirect traffic to the more desirable berths at Pier 3. So a well-built and secure pier for passenger traffic that could get rid of this confused landing process and the friction with the shipping lines over the use of another site. It sounded great. The project was put to tender in 1911 and work commenced shortly thereafter. The 1915 building, we see here a picture from 1913 when the concrete pier was in place, and one of the key features of the new shed is in evidence. The pier and the shed were slightly reduced in planning, but still almost 700 feet long and still 200 feet wide. but it was scored down the center line by this pair of railway tracks that became the spine, the backbone of the facility, which I just love for the symbolism. But after another year, in December 1914, you've got an exterior in place of this 2-story shed, and the interior was finished for the fall of 1915. And this shows us the Canadian Assembly Room in that space as of 1st of September 1915. Now, the 1915 building at Pier 2, it was such an improvement on prior quarters. It was comparable to the quarters that were eventually developed at Pier 21 in size, but all in a single building. It could accommodate these 2 ships at once. It improved passenger safety by housing sunken tracks with, moving from platform level onto the train instead of passengers, down at track level. The 1915 quarters also included spaces for support services, charities, the Red Cross, provincial agents, railway ticketing, telegraph agencies. In a lot of ways, this new building was really effective as an indicator for what we would find just a little bit later as they tried to develop a sound system of integrated immigrant accommodation, welcoming, and dispatch at Pier 21. So, problem though, the building was missing security fittings. And despite complaints, the problem wasn't remedied for years. In late 1920, about 35 detained immigrants effected their own entry into Canada by escaping from Pier 2. And the Halifax immigration agent, W.L. Barnstead, he had to hire police to literally sit with detained immigrants to prevent escapes. They changed this over from city police to posting RCMP officers to supervise the detention area. CNR promised action on barring windows and securing the skylights. The security of the place seemed to be in hand, but the escapes continued into January of 1921. CN was dragging its feet on updating the building. Actually, and 2 of the guys who ran for it in January of 1921, they were making their second run from the building, escaped the site twice while being detained from the same entry. The RCMP inspector in command of Halifax had enough, and he complained to Assistant Commissioner Cortland Starnes. He said, this pier is so inadequate in terms of security, that it presents conditions that are not quite fair to the force, right, to the police. So based on pressure from the RCMP, years after immigration had been asking for these updates, the detention quarters were better secured with, finally, bars on the windows that needed them, skylights, and sheathing on the walls to prevent breaking through at corners or partitions and so on. The RCMP remained on watch in the city for escaped immigrants and had to coordinate with city police and so on in residence searches. So this is an interesting point for me where we turn from history of the building to why this history matters, and we'll circle around on this a little more in just a moment. The problems of the railway's disregard for immigration requirements here contributed to these escapes, this is interesting. I like this. But the argument over the control of space, almost incidentally, opens for us a lens, right, on who was detained as being undesirable. This is information that doesn't come up otherwise. So an observation from one of the police officers involved in following up the escapes, a Sergeant Blakeby, he identified that Halifax residences the police search were Jewish, an implied identification of those who escaped that agrees with descriptions in the documents. The Halifax agent, Barnstead, stated that the detainees were a pretty tough crowd, and that if Halifax quarters had to detain any large number of these Jews, he would have to make use of the detention hospital instead. So, exploring the matter of detention at Pier 2 a little further, looking at sort of the background of these complaints, rolls us back 30 years, right back to our friend Edwin Clay before he managed to get himself fired, 30 years before. who wrote a report on the conduct of immigration in Halifax, complaining that among those he had to detain, right, the lower class of Jews and Italians should not be permitted to land in Canada. And his successor, early in the 1900s, F.W. Anon, he complained with an epithet about Jews detained at Halifax without funds, who he claimed left the accommodations teeming with pests. Now, investigating and understanding when and how the windows got barred leads us to who was detained therein, which leads us in a small way to an illumination of a much larger history of the exclusion and marginalization of Jewish immigrants by Canadian officials. And of course, you march along in Canadian historiography, and many of us will be familiar with, the work, for example, None is Too Many, and the consequences in humanitarian terms of anti-Semitism in the 1930s and the refusal of Jewish refugees from Europe seeking humanitarian admission. Who bars the skylights matters, So even as this new pier was under construction, the end of its service for immigration was in view, right? So some of the requirements for the new immigration facility were set aside in anticipation of permanent quarters to come at Pier 21 in Halifax Ocean Terminals. This was, a massive new development project in the city's south end to improve port and rail infrastructure. Among the necessities deferred, again, were proper civil detention accommodations. But that's, it is important to note, though, when we talk about who is taking charge of these projects, the general manager of the Intercolonial Railway, Frederick Catelius, he was involved in the direction of projects at Pier 2 and the Halifax Ocean Terminals, right? Now, this is a guy, his appointment, he got triple the pay of his predecessor. The entire authority of the previous governing commission of the railway stripped from the commission, vested in him, right? And he had this enormous autonomy of operation from Ottawa. He submitted an annual report, and that was pretty much his obligation. Wow, So when we talk about sort of the heft that the people involved with these projects could muster compared to your local immigration agent, this is by design in some ways and unsurprising in some ways, and yet it still reminds us, when we think of positioning the immigration department related to its own operations, they have to be bumped down the scale compared to other actors. So the railway crew, who was doing both of these large projects, they planned for the immigration quarters at Pier 2, even though they look lovely in that photograph we looked at, they were to be temporary, and the immigration department concurred. You could see in the city for years the massive work of civil engineering for the South End Ocean Terminals, filling the harbor and building this massive intrusion. And there were outward signs for the public too. So let's have a look here. This is, again, we have September of 1915 at Pier 2, opening with this Canadian Assembly Room. And here we are in October, just up the harbor, dropping in one of the pieces of foundation for the bulkhead passenger landing quay, which is the flat ground upon which Pier 21, Pier 20, where the farmers market has been until recently, and 23, sort of that whole flat space that's now called the Halifax Seaport. It all rests on a foundation like this, fill and the concrete blocks sunk in to reclaim. I guess it's called reclaiming, but it's really an intrusion into the harbor. With this kind of public display of the short future of the site, immigration officials adjusted their expectations in planning, right? Accepting smaller spaces, cheaper materials, on the grounds that it had to be temporary short-term quarters. the superintendent of immigration, W.D. Scott at that time, he directed reuse of materials from the little building at Pier 2 to this new Pier 2 building, as within, he said, 3 or 4 years, it's expected the quarters at the ocean terminals will be ready. Now, he said that in 1914. So his timeline was off by a decade, but the guiding sentiment was significant. They didn't expect to stay. And if we, there's a geographer, Jason Gilliland, who he talks about the port and its infrastructure as a circulatory system, which is a nice analogy. But in this case, everybody knows that Pier 2, this part of the port, it's headed for bypass surgery really soon. So nobody's getting too stuck on this part of the system. And because it's me and it's my presentation, I'm going to indulge myself with a little Pier 21 here to stray a little from focusing on Pier 2. The Immigration Department only moved into the successor, Pier 21, on the understanding that it too was a temporary accommodation, with more permanent structure to be built in the area that we see now. There's a little Mission to Seafarers cabin by the pedestrian underpass and the conventional freight piers, Pier A and A1 and B, south of Pier 23. That railway promise never happened, obviously. And the fancy building at Pier 2 burned to the ground in 1933, and immigration lived in the temporary shed that the railway built at Pier 21 for more than 40 years. Okay, so now that I have outlined in very quick and broad terms the histories of built immigration facilities at Pier 2, why should anyone care that Steve is talking more about immigration sheds, which, if anyone knows me, is a germane and pertinent question that deserves to be answered, because if left to my own devices, this is what I will do all the time. I think, though, that I actually have a good answer for that. And I'm going to go back and recall some of the things that we talked about a little bit earlier. So the first thing that I mentioned in terms of the value of getting these particularities of place explored is that the built implementation of a border policy can give researchers these concrete evidence of attitudes and practices and policies that are made real at a site. We talked about the 1897 building after the fire, which they didn't love very much. A senior bureaucrat with the immigration branch, Laval Fortier, he was actually top guy after it went to the Department of Interior for a little while. So this is a guy with some heft. He called the 1897 building barely sufficient for our needs. But in discussing the inadequacies, he shows us an important reason that this building didn't measure up. Something that we see literally built into later sites, and something that resonates in the present too. One of the reasons that the site got gobbled up is that they had to accommodate American inspection teams in that building. Part of the accommodation area for immigration quarters was turned over to these American inspectors for their examinations, meaning too, because of the design layout, that until the American inspections were complete, Canadian immigrants and passengers could be delayed. And ultimately, it could even cause delay for ships docking. Now, why would you do that, right? But Halifax as a port was super vulnerable to shifts in ocean traffic to ports like Portland or New York. And anything that could push American passengers away could endanger the commerce of the port in a larger sense. But drawing in and serving the American traffic meant marginalizing passengers in Canada, right? So some fun with this. This is a consideration that persists even a little bit into the contemporary. If I talk about placemaking at, the Canadian Museum of Immigration, if I talk about making place at Pier 21, many of us, if we're asked to picture Pier 21, right, the immigration history site, we picture this brick facade, right? The museum's main entrance. Well, fine. but that space was never a part of the Canadian immigration site. It's not part of the historic site. It's not designated. The only immigration processing that happened behind those walls was American. Now, the second thing that I talked about was how forms of official documentation about immigration can inform expressions of personal experience, right? Architecture and construction can do that too. So what I'm going to do with this one, I'm going to go in a little different direction here. Of course, at the Museum of Immigration, we often engage with things like oral histories and written stories, but I wanted to have a little fun with this in a different way. And so what I'm going to do is talk about a painting that many of us are familiar with, situated at Pier 2. And that is, of course, Arthur Lismer's depiction of the troopship Olympic at Pier 2 in 1919. This picture, I'm just going to sort of talk about what I see in it for a minute. Sort of on a surface level, what do we see? We see the Olympic, right, which is one of the largest ships going at that time. It's an impressive ship. We can see that Lismer has captured hundreds, maybe thousands of soldiers waiting to disembark. You know, we see the pier in the background there. There are some implications from this, right? There's an implication of adequacy, for one thing. The idea that the ship would call here because it can be served there adequately, right? There's sort of an authorization, a legitimation of the pier by associating it with the Olympics, such a grand vessel. And there's simply the numbers, right? So you come away with this painting, you know, with, among other things, a couple of specific messages about the site where it's arriving. I mean, there's other fun stuff too, once you go into it, you know, Lismer capturing the site where he arrived himself as an immigrant and so on. Those are fun. But for me, the story that comes to mind when I see this painting, and one of the things I love about coming back to this kind of personal expression about the past through the history of the implementation of the built site, is there's this story of the Olympic in 1917, arriving in November with 600 passengers for immigration and 2,000 soldiers. So the immigration team, they had to conduct interviews in a shipboard suite because most of, at this time, 1917, it's the biggest immigration quarters that were established at Pier 2. You know, fantastic space, but almost all of it was transferred to military control at this time, right? You've got a hospital in there, you've got movement control for the military in there. The immigration team is right back, you know, into the very tiniest little fraction of their quarters. So he goes and processes the passengers shipboard. He does it by class. He deals with cabin class people first, you know, about 170 cabin class passengers. But he could get away with that. But there was just about 500 passengers in dependents and steerage, and that was overwhelming, right? They worked from mid-afternoon into the evening. The ship had to be guarded overnight, and then they still hadn't got everyone. They had to get at it again the next day. That ship didn't clear for a day and a half, right? So, okay, that's fun, right? Now we know that this painting could also be imagined to show something of a schmozzle. But what does this do for us in terms of particularity of place? Well, we've heard a little bit about Pier 2, but in context, why is this fun? Because shipboard processing was absolutely the preferred method for the Laurentian ports, right? Where they could join from Port-au-Père and they could process people as the ship goes up the St. Lawrence, right? They could reduce the processing time for immigrants ashore. The shipping line, the ship would have to be less time in port. It was super efficient. Everybody preferred it, right? So the particularity of place makes, for what was probably the most significant and historically ocean port of immigration in Canada, Quebec, this process, which you might think of as best practice, was a complete messy failure tried in Halifax. Now, they did also try this on the West Coast, with officers joining from William Head, the quarantine facility at the south of Vancouver Island, and having a little processing time before the ship would arrive in Vancouver Harbor. This is less efficient, not so much of a game, and I just love that they tried this. They convinced, after the Second World War, inspecting officers convinced their supervisors to do a trial for them to join the ships in Hawaii. And so they got on the ships and did pre-processing from joining the ships in Hawaii to come into Vancouver. They only got away with that like twice. And then the supervisors were too much downtime. This doesn't work. It's not efficient. Again, particularity of place, but you gotta love that they tried to get away with it. That was awesome. Anyway, so the first thing that we think about with these aspects of significance, right, is that concrete evidence of practices or policies. The second thing that we have is illuminating these personal expressions, right? And the third thing is the ways that authorities worked to create and maintain immigration sites, giving us this glimpse into the relative power and influence of other actors. And it can position immigration in political culture of the time. Now, this, of course, is the body of my talk, right? So we're not going to recap all of that right now. Instead, we're going to go somewhere else. We've talked about that for Pier 2. What we're going to go do is I just mentioned the West Coast. We're going to go back. And we're going to talk about Victoria, BC, which is a port where we might think, at the turn of the 20th century, this is a time, what do we have in Canadian immigration at this time, right? We got the head tax, right? Continuous journey is coming down the pipe. Anti-Asian immigration money requirements are being added. And with all of these policies and sort of stringent guidance in place, we would imagine, we would intuit, that the facilities would reflect some kind of position of strength for the immigration branch. Well, about that. In fact, it's the Department of Health that creates the unique structure and practice for entry processing in Victoria, BC through the late 19th and early 20th century. In contrast to an energetic engagement from public health and immigration medical authorities with arrival in Vancouver early in the 20th century and the late 19th, excuse me, the Federal Immigration Department actually completely withdrew from its facilities in BC at this time, even as other ports, like when I was talking about Pier 2 getting built up in the 1890s, right? Not on the West Coast, right? And so this resulted in a very strange situation in the 1890s, where in Victoria, BC, you had 8 US immigration officers. You had at least one supporting doctor in it, I think maybe others. But no Canadian federal immigration staff at all posted in the port. At need, customs officials, and customs ran the head tax. Customs officials could fill in ex officio. But right, this is not how we would think of this period of immigration on the West Coast, right? At the insistence of Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, the chief medical officer for the Department of the Interior, facilities were restored to Victoria, excuse me, not Vancouver, in the early 1900s, with the principal building at Victoria being this detention hospital. And he did insist it not be called a shed, because he told the local agent that it would hurt his feelings if it was called a shed. So we will call it a hospital. Further, several of the federal immigration agents responsible for processing at that hospital, they were cross-appointed. They were doctors, right, who were vested as well with the authority as immigration agents, which led to predictable corruption later. But health inspection and public health were the significant influences on Canadian immigration policies in Victoria. Now, they influenced policy and practice everywhere in immigration, certainly, and I don't want to reduce that, but this is another level. And so when a traveling inspector from Ottawa comes in 1905 and checks out these cross-appointed doctors in Victoria, he writes a note back and these guys are actually not bothering to do the civil examination regarding immigration at all. They're just doing the medical check and that's it. So we see particularity of place, right? Showing the relative influence of actors, and whether we go here on the East Coast or we go to the West Coast in this time period, we see very different actors overwhelming the immigration branch in different ways, but we do see it overwhelmed, even at a time when sort of typically we think of it as a, you know, a kind of a monolithic engine. So just to conclude, you know, this exploration of the built history of Halifax's ocean immigration facilities at Pier 2, it shows us this reshaping affected by strategic change, right? Strategic change in rail and ocean transportation, led by these transportation companies, and especially the railways, directed shifts in the passenger and immigration processing in our city. Further, though, I just want to touch one other thing here as we wrap up, which is the exploration, I think, takes us a little way in considering how these places are made in memory and in commemoration. There's a book by William Turkle, his 2007 work, Archive of Place. And it talks about the idea of place in three parts: that people recover traces of the past to support an interpretation, but that these traces give rise to representations that actually undermine what is represented. And that finally, this archive of place is imagined, emergent. It is invested with intangible associations that shape the interpretation of it as much as the physical traces. Now, Turkle was mining the geography of plateaus in the BC interior for meaning. But if we set his work against our experience of Halifax's public historical landscape, we see the corollary, which is the unmaking of place by forgetting. And we have memorials that are really proper to Pier 2, strewn along our waterfront, usually without any acknowledgement of the problem of geography, right? And dislocating those memories reinforces the erasure of Pier 2 just as surely as the physical traces of the last immigration shed on the site were wiped out by fire in 1933. So as a public historian interested in and invested in immigration at Halifax, I really hope that from this talk, you're encouraged to remember and replace Pier 2 when you think about our city, its present, and its past. Thank you.
Some people are clapping in the in their little emoticon things. Thanks, Steve. That was really, really, really interesting. The connections that you made between transportation companies and immigration and built place and opinion of the time is super interesting. And I love a good public history angle, as you know. So we can do questions in the chat if somebody, it's a few people saying thank you in the chat, Steve. There's a few options. You can send a message in the chat to myself or the entire group, or if you want, you can raise your hand or unveil yourself, open your, it's kind of a weird way to put it. You can start your video and you can also ask it live, because sometimes that's makes for a much better question period. And I think that Shirley has already gotten first dibs and she would like to ask it live.
Sure.
She's unveiled herself.
I know. Hello, Steven. That was a lot of fun and really interesting. It's a pleasure to see the pleasure you take in these stories. the role of the immigration of the transportation companies is obviously huge. And I think it sounds like everything from the 1880s to 1928 was a kind of a shambles of inadequate provision by the transportation companies. But I'm a little fuzzy still on the kind of the public-private partnership deal here. Was it simply, as you said about the earliest period that you talked about, there's a statutory requirement that the firm deliver, a firm carrying immigrants contribute space for their processing at Halifax? Or, was it an ad hoc negotiation every time? I'm kind of curious as to, how, what
Perfect.
the setup was that made it so bad.
No, exactly. So there, it is a hot mess, and it's a hot mess enough that actually it kept on being a hot mess well after Pier 21 opened, such that nobody knew they had to pay utility bills at the site for 5 years after it opened. And Christmas of 1933, the Port Authority, which had taken over for CNR, has to write Pier 21 and say, listen, we're shutting off the lights and the steam because you haven't paid a bill in 5 years. And so Frederick Blair goes back and says, how did we get here? And he has this short synopsis of like the relationships that the different immigration sites in the major Atlantic ports have, generally with the railway, but by that time passing out from private railways to the government railway and on to port authorities, right? And even with the standardization of relationships falling under port authorities, it's still a mess. They pay rent inconsistently. They're not clear on involving public works, and the leases are not. It's not well regulated at all. So there is a statutory requirement, and that does seem to succeed in terms of extracting the use of space. But often that space is like a barely reconverted cargo shed, things like that. It is interesting, and I wouldn't want to understate the significance of the inland presence of these railway companies either. The shed in Winnipeg, for example, has been the subject of writing by Rob Weinberg. And among other things, besides being a tremendously important destination for settlers bound to the west, was also implicated in the deliberate dispersal of the Japanese Canadian community at the end of internment. So these sheds, as we look at the history of their buildings and their relationship in sort of governance and power structure, there are lots of threads to pick up. But I can't identify for you a consistent relationship. And in the 20s and 30s, neither could the department.
Yeah.
Sorry?
That's great. I mean, it really is striking how, the customs house was always like this big, beautiful building, really sturdy. And then the immigration building is traditionally called a shed, for God's sake.
Yeah, well, I mentioned Dr. Bryce's response to the idea of having this beautiful hospital called a shed. Oh, he was affronted.
Yeah.
No, there, interestingly too, and again, to look at Pier 2, the last building, sort of the really lovely one, the main floor of that did fill customs functions, right? And when you look at Pier 21, it's actually a complex of two buildings, right? Which are actually pretty much equivalent in size. One is a second-story, barely reconverted cargo shed used for immigration, which is the waterside shed, right? And then the inland shed, which was actually purpose-built, was the customs annex. Now, the sign on it now says immigration annex, but they're wrong.
Okay.
It was built for customs. That's where bags were processed, right? And so certainly when we're talking about these buildings and the functions they fill, it's interesting to remember as well, sort of the other government department that had sway. And if customs hadn't got that concession of the inland building, I would be curious to see how the power dynamic might have moved on building that other building that was promised.
I'll
And
hand
we
the
might have
floor over
fancier
to
digs.
others.
I really
No,
regret that. Anyway.
I'll hand over the floor to other people with other questions.
Yeah, sure.
I can, I'll talk to you later. Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
We have a
Thank
few
you.
questions. Laura, it looks like maybe you want to ask a question, but I have some that came through in the chat there directly to me. I think Steve, we've got some people who want you to kind of give a scene setting kind of visual. So
absolutely.
a couple of people, well, there's just one second. I'll read some of the questions. So one person, Corinne, I'm not sure if they're in the meeting right now because I couldn't send a message directly, but, and this is perhaps a good question. Maybe some people might be wondering, where exactly is Pier 2 located? Like, I guess in current reference.
Okay, so I'll beg the crowd's indulgence, and because it's out of my presentation. Finding the right balance of slides and presentation is always hard, but I came prepared. So we have a bunch of other visuals here, and we can go back to the city map, and then also some visuals of buildings that were in place, just so we can have a quick look. But it's going to look messy while I do it because it's not quite as elegant as a preset presentation.
Sure.
So first of all, we will all thank our friends at the Halifax Municipal Archives for a beautiful map. And I will pull that up for our consultation. Okay, so this is the gorgeous map of Halifax in 1910, and Pier 2 is just down here. Now, what I may do is pull my presentation back up or look for the cropped version of it that zooms in a little bit, but we can see it's basically just north of where the casino is now, kind of in the space where the southern edge of the naval base is. So if you stand and you look and you see sort of the first place you see some warships tied up sometimes, it's right around there. Now, Pier 2 itself over time, there are so many gorgeous pictures. What are we going to pick? Let's see. So here we have Pier 2 after the cargo pier was improved, but before there was the beautiful 1915 building with the grain elevator still in place. Let's see. Now, this is a gorgeous series of pictures from Library and Archives Canada during the construction of the 1915 building. The company that was contracted had a photographer that took pictures all the way through. And so there's just a ton of gorgeous, gorgeous images documenting the construction. And this is, if people missed it, this is where this beautiful image of the gentleman with his horse and cart doing fill for the pier was captured. And we can see sort of, a more modern structure for construction in the background here. I think a crane, but then I just love this image. The idea of working on that big, 1915 modern pier, but filling it one cartload at a time with fill. There's also, a number of striking shots of construction coming after that sort of spine of the building shot that I showed. Here it is a little further along, and we can see where the pillars of the building are going to go into place, showing the width of the shed on this big pier. But also, you really begin to envision what that bottom space is going to look like as an interior. And there is a shot that I set aside for this, showing that interior space of the lower floor of Pier 2. So here, previously at Pier 2, right, joining the train was a matter of going outside, and especially if you were coming from Pier 3, that meant crossing the rails. And this, unfortunately, this led to accidents. There's quite a history of the immigration officer complaining about yet another immigrant getting hurt, moving from ship to train. So in this case, you have it at platform height and a much safer way to join. Finally, because if you get me into these pictures, I'll stay all day, and I shouldn't do that. There are some really remarkable shots sort of showing the industry of the construction. But the one I thought was really visually neat is this one of all the pilings for the pier. And this is across the harbor. They're going to be moved over for construction. But it just gives a sense of the scope of the project in a very different way. So I just love this shot. Anyway, the whole, this is a tiny sampling, and there's actually an enormous file of photographic documentation of the construction of this site. It's beautiful, and I would recommend to anyone that it is well worth your time. The other resource that I went to was the scrapbook from Nova Scotia Archives, and it's a little more limited what I have here to show from it today. But there's just this one other shot that shows sort of just at the turn of the century. This is Pier 3. And we just get a hint of where Pier 2 is, but it's interesting to me because it shows the environs which burned. So, yeah.
So Mark wants to know what the scene outside might have been like. And I don't know if you have a picture of an actual
oh, there's a famous
live
shot
moment. So wondering, like,
there's a
yeah.
famous shot, again, Nova Scotia Archives. It's a McCaskill photo, and I do have it to hand somewhere.
So Mark also says that his great grandmother came through Pier 2 December in 1904 on Christmas Eve, and he wants to visualize it and like what might it have looked like. Her husband has already arrived. Would he have been sitting in the cold, or would he have gone to a pub, or like what would it have been? A horrible experience? Would it have been a nice experience?
Okay. I mean, arriving at the pier, this is a shot from 1928, which is quite a bit later. Now, this is the last building at Pier 2, and definitely the nicest. By this time, the immigration agents have generally got control over the entry of public into the spaces of the immigration facility during ship arrival. So while people might have met like near the grounds or possibly even near the train, the actual immigration facility on the second floor, no, not so much. The earlier buildings, I mentioned at one point, the 1890 and 1897 buildings were on pilings. And there's this wonderful complaint from Clay, again, before he gets himself fired, talking with such shock about the members of the public coming down and smoking, but not only smoking, but drinking under the pier on Sundays. So there's sort of this picture of just stuff happening under the immigration pier. And peddlers coming in, hackmen as they were called in the day, sort of, people running like cabs of the day. There's a story of a guy who sold clocks just coming in and hanging one on the wall, walking out, and a month later sending a bill. Like the early buildings were a little bit chaos and mayhem. But there was a much smaller scale of entry too. By the time Halifax is seeing significant scales of entry, the immigration officers have generally begun to control the interior space of the sites a little more. In terms of meeting someone, meeting in Halifax was a little bit unusual because most people were bound elsewhere, frankly. But you could certainly coordinate it through the shipping agent, and what that would look like, whether it would be like, with the shipping agent's office nearby or whatever, hard to say. At the earlier buildings, waiting for someone, because it would have been principally active in winter and so on, maybe it wouldn't have been a great experience. But typically, there would have been adequate notice of a ship arrival that you wouldn't have been, terribly inconvenienced. Later, pretty comfortable, if you were able to go to the site to meet them.
And is the location that you're showing now, is that the or that you just had there, was that the location that would have been like earlier in like the 1850s? Was it always the same spot, or would it have?
1850s, I mean, that really predates sort of what we're dealing with here.
If somebody was wondering about 1850, but just curious.
Yeah, no, I out of my scope, unfortunately.
Okay.
I apologize.
Yeah. I think at one point Laura Carter had her screen on as she possibly wanted to ask a question.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. And I have to do it quickly, Steve, because I'm on board for toddler bedtime.
Oh, I feel you.
Yeah, I knew you would. Thank you for this chat. Thank you for giving us a chance to get back into this. My question was around the security or lack thereof at Pier 2, all of those open spaces with no way of controlling flow of people. Is that what directly led to Pier 21 being full of fences and cages?
So the interval installation there, the nice building at Pier 2 that we saw just now in the McCaskill photo, the upstairs of that looks a lot more like what you or I would recognize from the interior floor plan of Pier 21, right? So you have a defined assembly area, you have, like pipe railings guiding people from point to point, you have immigration guards, and so the flow of people is much more constrained, but also it's the second floor. They're moving out when they're supposed to by controlled routes. So, the early sites, if they get landed at Pier 3, goodness only knows. If you're going through the later buildings, it's not quite as well controlled as we saw at Pier 21, but yeah, there's better. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. I'm running away. Thanks, everyone.
It's good to see you, Carter.
John Reed has a question. He has unveiled himself for the question.
Oh, great. Hi, John.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks, Steve. Very, very interesting. And my question, I suppose, is partly inspired by the recent pandemic, where airlines really, in many respects, became the enforcers for international health regulations in that case. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, particularly in the context you mentioned that certain groups, Jewish and Italian groups, face discrimination in terms of entry into Canada. Was there any sense in which the shipping lines kind of proactively discriminated against certain people?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And were there consequences from the shipping lines if their passengers were denied entry to Canada?
Yes, absolutely, and that's a great question. And it remains pertinent because the carriers remain on the hook for deportation, right? The reason that the immigration authorities were able to involve the shipping lines in screening is that they were liable if they brought someone who was inadmissible. In the case of Halifax, actually, our city charter had a provision where a carrier could be liable if somebody brought someone who was poor. Forget about health. And often, health and wealth are the two sort of big immigration screening factors that we never quite managed to include in polite conversation. But it was very definitely significant. For me, when we talk about the involvement of shipping lines, there are some interesting entanglements between shipping lines, foreign governments, and foreign public health agencies. And this kind of reaches a weird climax in the 1930s. And there's a set of photographs held with the Immigration Medical Service collections at Library and Archives Canada of a sanitation camp created in Poland for people who are leaving. It's sort of the ultimate expression, and I feel terrible exploring this, forgive me, but there's a very strong prejudice through the late 19th and early 20th century about immigration from Central and Eastern Europe that included stereotypes about cleanliness, about pests, disease. Alan Kraut, sort of with his work on the foreignness of germs and the implication of the immigrant and unwellness, addresses sort of some of the framework around this well. He's American, but his work holds really nicely. But there was this camp that was created, you know, and you know, at the interest of shipping lines, people would go there, and there's a report going with sort of an inspection visit along with these photographs from a Canadian immigration official talking about, you know, delousing the immigrants, fumigating them with Cyclone B, you know, steaming their bags, having them go through showers, seeing that they're all inoculated and that they've got up-to-date x-rays and so on. It's this massive industrial cleansing center before they're allowed to board a ship. And this is sort of the culmination of a steady process in the escalation of overseas screening, right? And I don't think I quite see it's like anywhere else later. But absolutely, you know, we see, you know, people getting tickets, for example, from the Red Star Line certifying their cleanliness before they go and join their ship to come to Canada, right? In the context of sort of the North American seaboard, the question of entry and public health and disease is certainly a live one. Less controlled. A lot of the shipping is like not passenger shipping in that way, but like passenger ships or little packets that go back and forth. And a number of them wind up implicated in the quarantine system because of outbreaks among the crew. And in fact, the harbor island, Lawler's Island, there are a few unknown graves, a very few, but there are also some marked graves for Nova Scotia sailors who worked on an American schooner. And, you know, the exchange of potentially disease was certainly an active topic between doctors here in Halifax and their counterparts points south. But that responsibility for the deportation, that's the hook that makes other policies like continuous journey work too, right? Continuous journey is rationalized because if you have to change a shipping line, it's the line that's responsible for deporting you. And so if you changed, say you're coming across the Pacific and you go port in India, port in Japan, Hawaii, Canada, and you change lines twice, who's on the hook to get you home? And so, you know, it's this idea of reasoning wrongness, right? As a justification for a policy that is, you know, it's meant to obscure explicitly a racist exclusion of proper British subjects from a British dominion. But you can reason it around this implication of the carriers in the responsibility to take people away.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks for the question.
So I think we'll probably just have time for one more question. Judith Vinegard, would you like to unmute yourself and ask a question? Judith, you're not muted, or sorry, you are still muted. There you go.
Unmuted now?
There we are. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. Hello, Stephen. I think I was in touch with you a few years ago about one of the employees of the immigration department who was possibly the first translator or interpreter, called Joseph Bernstein. He was brought on board when the Doukhobors came in 1899.
Yeah.
And my question is not to go into his life except in two ways. He, in fact, claimed that he did spend some of the summers at the Quebec immigration facilities. And so I wondered, as far as the hiring was concerned, whether that happened to many people on the in the immigration system, many employees. And my other question was that he got into difficulty and got fired a few years later. But he was dealing with some issues that brought up the whole business of the prevalence of trachoma amongst, or the concern
yes.
about it amongst immigrants. And in any case, I certainly found some rather discouraging information about two of the doctors that were working in the immigration in Pier 2. This would have been about 1906, between 1906 and 1908.
Yeah, this is the yes. Sorry, please continue.
Well, no, it's really, I mean, that's just really a comment. I mean,
well, I would love to expand on that comment.
Okay, go ahead, please do.
Yeah, so I mean, you're walking us right into the period where pseudo-medical exclusion is such a big deal in Canadian immigration. So you have trachoma, you have hookworm, you have a number of things, even the idea of climatic unsuitability that's levied against Black people, right? And they attempt to use these sort of pseudo-medical exclusions to justify, in a sense of public health or in the individual's interest, their exclusion or a group exclusion from Canada. Now, I think trachoma gets, it comes up quite a lot, and I'm going to circle back to the West Coast, because there you have, I mentioned the corruption of having a doctor who is also the immigration officer. Trachoma, of course, in the early stages, even at that point, being treatable. They had the power to say, I'm giving you your first inspection as the doctor. I can find you inadmissible, make a recommendation to the immigration officer, who is myself, and you will be refused. Or you can pay me for treatment, and then you will be admissible. And the scale of corruption of one of these guys in extorting payment for medical services from Chinese immigrants got to such a point that the Prime Minister stepped in to remove him as an immigration officer. And if you think of the level of abuse that would have been deemed unacceptable towards a Chinese immigrant in that period, you can imagine the scope of this guy's corruption. He was not a good person. In terms of hookworm, there's a really excellent long discussion of it in connection with Sikh immigration on the West Coast. And again, we see our friend Peter Henderson-Bryce stepping in a long exchange with his counterparts in immigration, including Scott. And basically, one of his last letters, he boils down and he says, listen, I can make this something that because the immigration medical staff come from the Immigration Medical Service, which is not actually under the immigration branch, it's under health and welfare. And Bryce says, I can make my doctors check for this. It's not much fun because, it involves sifting stool samples, but we can do it. But let's be clear that this is being done solely as cover for exclusion for another reason, because hookworm is no danger at all in Canada. It's a warm weather problem for people in bare feet, right? And if you're asking me to look for this in immigrants who are coming to Canada, to live in Canada, this is disingenuous, and I just have to tell you baldly that it has nothing to do with science. And it's a remarkable exchange. But for me, it embodies sort of that moment of pseudo-medical exclusion. And there were certainly numbers of people in the immigration branch who were perfectly content to use these pretexts, whether it's climatic unsuitability against Oklahoma farmers, or trachoma wherever they could find it, or hookworm against South Asian immigrants.
Very interesting, thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm really pleased you raised it.
Okay, I think maybe we'll wrap it up. It's almost 9 o'clock. Lois, do you have anything that you need to announce or say?
No, I have nothing to announce. Stephen, that was a fascinating. I had no idea that Pier 2 had that kind of a distorted and intricate history. I'm hoping you will take an advantage. You said it was removed from your original manuscript. You will now have an opportunity to have it published as an article if you're interested in going ahead. And I hope you will be.
Sure.
Wonderful story. I have a question, but I'll save it for some other time because we are moving along here. Sarah, did you want to announce the December meeting and the presentation?
Yes, well, Judith Bingard is the December
Yes.
speaker, and she's here. So the Judith's talk is titled "Two Girls Named Blanche: Race, Gender, and Education in Turn of the 20th Century Halifax," and it's on December 8th at 7 p.m. So that's the next time we will gather, and it will not be in person.
That is correct. It will be by Zoom
Still
one
Zoom.
more time at least. But I noticed
else.
it has enabled many people to participate this evening. I thank everyone for coming. We'll look forward to seeing you next month and hearing you. Thank you, Stephen, again. And I think we can now call for adjournment. Anyone like to move adjournment? Then I will. Thank you again, everyone, and good night.